You probably believe, without ever having questioned it much, that milk, left without refrigeration, lasts a single day, maybe 2 at the outside, before it turns and has to be poured down the drain. That belief is not exactly wrong. It is simply badly incomplete, and the missing half of it was worked out, independently, by desert herders, steppe nomads, and mountain villagers across 3 separate regions of the world, centuries before anyone had a word for bacteria or a machine that could keep anything cold. They discovered that milk does not have to be preserved despite souring. It can be preserved because of it, and if you take that soured milk one step further, pressing it dry under the open sun until it hardens into something closer to a stone than a food, you end up with a substance that can sit in a saddlebag, a tent, or a stone pantry for months, sometimes years, through blistering desert heat and freezing mountain winters alike, without spoiling, without refrigeration, and without losing the protein and salt that kept armies, caravans, and entire families alive through seasons when fresh milk simply did not exist. This entire family of related foods goes by different names in different places: Qurut out on the steppes of Central Asia, Kashk across Iran, Tarhana in Anatolia, Jameed among the Bedouin of Jordan, but they are, at their true biochemical core, versions of the exact same underlying idea, arrived at separately by people who almost certainly never met each other, solving the exact same problem with the exact same basic tools: milk, salt, time, and sunlight. Subscribe to Historia Survival, and tell me in the comments right now where you are watching from, because this is the story of a forgotten superfamily of survival food that fed Mongol armies, built a national dish in the modern Middle East, and is still sitting in kitchen pantries today, doing exactly the job it has done for well over 1,000 years. The clearest and most vividly documented account of this technology in action comes from the 13th century, from a Flemish Franciscan friar named William of Rubruck, who traveled deep into the Mongol Empire in the 1250s on a diplomatic and missionary mission, and left behind one of the most detailed eyewitness descriptions of Mongol daily life available to modern historians. Rubruck was fascinated, in the way a careful and slightly bewildered outsider often is, by the specific foods that sustained the nomadic armies and households he encountered on the steppe. And he devoted real attention in his written account to a hardened, sun-dried curd the Mongols carried with them, describing it in a phrase that has been quoted by food historians ever since, as hard as iron slag. That description was not an exaggeration or a traveler's embellishment. Qurut, the dried curd Rubruck was describing, is made by fermenting milk, traditionally from sheep, goats, cows, camels, or mares, depending on the specific herding culture and region, straining out the whey until what remains is a thick, sour curd, and then working that curd, often with the addition of salt, into small balls or flattened discs that are set out to dry in direct sunlight for days. Rubruck's account went further than simply describing the finished product. He documented, with the careful attention of a genuinely curious observer, the household economy built around Mongol dairy processing more broadly, noting how mare's milk was churned into the fermented, mildly alcoholic drink kumis, prized highly enough that it was reserved largely for those of higher social standing within a household or camp, while the byproduct curds left over from that process along with soured milk from other animals, were worked into the dried qurut that ordinary soldiers and travelers carried as portable rations. This detail matters because it shows that qurut was not simply a food invented in isolation. It emerged as the practical, waste-nothing endpoint of a broader dairy processing system that squeezed every possible use out of a herd's milk supply, turning what would otherwise have been a byproduct into one of the most strategically important foods the Mongol military establishment relied upon. The result is genuinely, deliberately hard, dense enough that it cannot simply be bitten into and chewed the way a modern cheese might be. It is meant to be dissolved, either directly in the mouth over an extended period the way a hard candy dissolves, or crumbled and stirred into hot water or broth to reconstitute it into something closer to a savory, protein-rich soup or beverage. If you are already struck by how deliberately engineered this sounds for a 13th century nomadic food, subscribe to Historia Survival, because the reason it worked so well is exactly what conventional wisdom about milk gets wrong. Now stay with me. The common assumptions that milk simply spoils, full stop, without refrigeration, is true only for fresh, unaltered milk left sitting at room temperature. What the makers of Qurut, Kashk, Tarhana, and Jameed all independently discovered through generations of practical trial and error, long before anyone understood the microbiology behind it, is that deliberately encouraging milk to sour, using specific fermenting cultures rather than random, uncontrolled spoilage bacteria, actually protects it rather than destroying it. When milk ferments under controlled conditions, lactic acid bacteria consume the milk's natural sugars and produce lactic acid as a byproduct, and this acid dramatically lowers the milk's pH, creating an environment that is genuinely hostile to the harmful, disease-causing bacteria responsible for actual spoilage and food poisoning. Salt, added deliberately during processing in nearly every version of this food across every culture that makes it, compounds this effect by drawing out remaining moisture through osmosis and further inhibiting bacterial growth through simple physical dehydration. And then the final step, sun-drying, removes the great majority of the remaining water content entirely, driving what food scientists call water activity down to a level so low that the specific bacteria, molds, and yeasts responsible for food spoilage simply cannot metabolize or reproduce, no matter how warm the surrounding air becomes. Food scientists today describe this specific combination using the term water activity, a measurement of how much of a food's total water content is actually available to support microbial growth, as opposed to water that has become chemically bound up with proteins, sugars, or salt and is therefore biologically inert as far as bacteria and mold are concerned. Fresh milk carries a water activity high enough to support rapid bacterial growth almost immediately at room temperature, which is precisely why it spoils so quickly without refrigeration. Properly fermented and sun-dried qurut, by contrast, can achieve a water activity level low enough that it falls below the threshold required for essentially any spoilage organism to grow at all, placing it in the same broad preservation category, functionally speaking, as honey, hardtack, or salted, air-dried meat, foods from entirely different culinary traditions that all independently arrived at the same underlying physical principle for defeating microbial spoilage. This three-part process, fermentation to build acid, salt to draw out moisture and further suppress bacteria, and sun-drying to eliminate water activity almost entirely, is why a food made from milk, one of the most notoriously perishable substances in the entire human diet, could be packed into a saddlebag and carried across a desert or a steppe for months without spoiling. It is not a trick or a workaround. It is a genuinely sound piece of applied food chemistry, discovered independently through nothing more than careful observation and generations of repeated practice by cultures that had no access to a laboratory, a microscope, or any formal understanding of what a bacterium even was. Drop a comment if you are still here and subscribe to Historia Survival so the next one reaches you, because the reach of this single idea across completely unconnected regions of the world is the part of this story that deserves real attention. On the Mongol steppe, Qurut, and its Persian and Central Asian cousin Kashk functioned as a genuine strategic asset, not merely a household pantry item. Mongol armies under Genghis Khan and his successors achieved a degree of mobility and range that stunned every settled civilization they encountered, and historians studying Mongol military logistics consistently point to the army's food supply as one of the quiet, underappreciated foundations of that mobility. A mounted force that had to stop regularly to hunt, forage, or wait for slow-moving supply carts loaded with perishable provisions could never move at the speed the Mongols became famous for. A force whose soldiers each carried a supply of dried, protein-dense curd that could be dissolved in water or broth within minutes, requiring no cooking fire, no extended preparation, and no risk of spoiling during a multi-week campaign, could range far ahead of anything resembling a conventional supply line. Qurut let Mongol soldiers travel light and fast precisely because their food did not need the constant tending that fresh provisions demanded, a genuinely significant military advantage hiding inside what looks, at first glance, like nothing more than a hardened ball of dried milk, thousands of miles to the west and south, among the Bedouin herding communities of what is now Jordan. An almost identical piece of food technology developed independently to solve an almost identical problem. How do you preserve the milk of your goats and sheep through the long, harsh desert seasons when fresh milk is abundant only briefly, and grazing conditions force families to move constantly across vast, arid distances? The resulting product, Jameed, dried yogurt formed into hard balls exactly as durable and exactly as long-lasting as its Central Asian cousin, became so deeply woven into Bedouin household economy and hospitality tradition that it eventually became the defining ingredient of Jordan's modern national dish, mansaf, a lamb and rice dish built around a rich, tangy sauce made by rehydrating and cooking down Jameed. Mansaf today carries enormous cultural and symbolic weight in Jordan, served at weddings, funerals, and state occasions alike, and its central ingredient remains, at its technological core, exactly the same dried, fermented, salt-preserved dairy product that desert herders were relying on for basic caloric survival centuries before anyone thought to build a national identity around it. Bedouin production of Jameed follows a broadly similar arc, though shaped by the specific rhythms of a herding calendar built around goats and sheep rather than the horses and cattle that dominated Mongol dairy economy. Milk collected during the spring and early summer, when grazing conditions are at their best, and herds produce a genuine surplus beyond what a family can consume fresh. It's fermented into a thick yogurt, strained to remove excess whey, salted, and then shaped by hand into round balls that are set out on cloth or trays to dry fully under the desert sun, sometimes over the course of a full week or more, depending on humidity and temperature. The finished Jameed is stored, often for the better part of a year, in cloth sacks or ceramic containers, providing a family with a reliable source of dairy protein and flavor that stretches through the leaner months when the herd's milk production naturally drops off. When a family needs it, whether for an ordinary meal or, more significantly, to prepare mansaf for guests or a special occasion, the hardened Jameed is soaked and then cooked down into a thick, tangy sauce, its intensely concentrated salt and dairy flavor rehydrating back into something that bears a genuine, recognizable resemblance to the fresh yogurt it began as many months earlier. The third branch of this family, Tarhana, developed among the Turkic peoples of Central Asia and traveled westward into Anatolia alongside the broader Seljuk and later Ottoman migrations and conquests that reshaped the region across the medieval period. Tarhana differs from Qurut and Jameed in one significant way. Rather than being pure dried yogurt, it combines fermented yogurt with wheat flour and often vegetables, creating a dried, coarse powder that functions less as a standalone protein ration and more as an instant soup base reconstituted with hot water or stock into a thick, savory, filling meal. The exact linguistic origins of the word remain genuinely debated among historians of Turkish and Persian language, with no single definitive source universally agreed upon, though many trace it through Persian intermediary terms such as Tarhane or Tahun, back to a root broadly associated with the concept of a portable or preserved soup base, a genuinely fitting description for a product designed from the outset to compress a full cooked meal into a lightweight, shelf-stable powder that any traveler, soldier, or winter household could reconstitute in minutes. The Ottoman-era production of Tarhana carried its own specific household ritual, well documented in later Turkish culinary histories and still recognizable in the practices of rural families today. Yogurt, wheat flour, or bulgur, and often chopped tomatoes, onions, and peppers were mixed and left to ferment together over a period ranging from a single day up to a full week, depending on ambient temperature and the specific regional recipe. A fermentation driven by a combination of lactic acid bacteria from the yogurt and wild yeasts naturally present in the flour and vegetables. Once fermentation had progressed sufficiently, the thick paste was spread thin across cloth or trays and left to dry fully in the sun, typically over 10 to 15 additional days, before being crumbled by hand into the coarse, shelf-stable powder that could then be stored in cloth sacks for a year or more. Tarhana's specific combination of fermented dairy and grain made it particularly valuable during the harsh, food-scarce winter months across the mountainous regions of Anatolia, a genuinely different environmental problem from the deserts and steppes that produced Jameed and Qurut, but one solved using precisely the same underlying fermentation and drying chemistry. If you want to understand why this same solution kept independently reappearing across such wildly different environments, subscribe to Historia Survival, because the answer says something genuinely important about how human food technology actually develops. None of these three regional traditions borrowed the idea from one another in any documented, traceable way. Central Asian steppe herders, Levantine desert Bedouin, and Anatolian mountain villagers were not reading each other's cookbooks or trading recipes along established caravan routes, at least not in any way the historical record clearly documents. What they shared instead was a common set of raw materials: milk-producing livestock, salt and reliable sunlight, and a common, universal problem. How do you keep dairy protein edible and available across the months when fresh milk simply is not being produced, whether because of a harsh winter, a dry season, or a herd on the move across unforgiving terrain? This pattern, sometimes called convergent cultural evolution by anthropologists studying food technology across unconnected societies, shows up again and again throughout the broader history of preservation techniques, from unrelated cultures independently discovering salt curing for meat to entirely separate civilizations independently arriving at fermentation as a way of stabilizing vegetables. Independent invention of essentially the same core technology, fermentation plus salt plus sun-drying, across cultures with no meaningful contact with one another, is a strong signal that this specific solution was not a lucky cultural accident. It was close to the only reliable answer available to anyone working with the same basic materials and the same basic constraint, discovered again and again because it was, quite simply, the correct answer to the problem every dairy-keeping culture eventually had to solve. What makes this particular survival technology worth understanding today is not merely its historical reach, but its genuine persistence. Dried yogurt in its various regional forms did not vanish once refrigeration and industrial dairy processing became widely available across the 20th century. The way so many other pre-modern preservation techniques quietly disappeared once cheaper, easier industrial alternatives arrived. Qurut remains a staple ingredient across the kitchens of Central Asia, Iran, and the Caucasus today, valued not merely as a nostalgic throwback, but as a genuinely useful pantry staple for herding communities in remote regions where refrigerated supply chains still do not reliably reach. Jameed remains, if anything, more culturally central in Jordan today than it likely was even a century ago, its role in Mansaf having transformed a practical desert preservation technique into a load-bearing symbol of national identity and hospitality. Tarhana remains a genuine winter pantry staple across rural Anatolia, still prepared by hand in late summer by families following methods passed down through generations, dried on rooftops and windowsills in the same late-season sun that has always done the final, essential work of locking the fermented mixture into a shelf-stable form. The persistence of dried yogurt into the modern era is not simply cultural sentimentality. It reflects a genuinely rational recognition, in exactly the communities that developed it, that the specific problem this technology solves, reliable protein storage without dependence on electricity or refrigeration, has never actually gone away for herding families in remote deserts, high mountain villages, and steppe grazing lands. No matter how thoroughly industrial refrigeration has transformed food storage in wealthy urban centers elsewhere in the world, disaster preparedness organizations and off-grid living communities in the 21st century have in recent years begun independently rediscovering fermented, sun-dried dairy as a genuinely viable long-term protein source for exactly the same reasons Mongol soldiers and Bedouin herders relied on it centuries earlier. It requires no power source, no specialized equipment beyond salt and sunlight, and it delivers a dense, storable, genuinely nutritious source of protein, precisely when and where refrigerated alternatives are least likely to be available: in a power outage, a remote homestead, or a supply chain disruption that a modern family is just as vulnerable to as a 13th century caravan ever was. The next time you reach for a tub of refrigerated yogurt sitting in a grocery store's cold case, cooled by a compressor running on a power grid that could, in theory, always fail without warning, understand that the food inside that tub carries within it a far older, far more resilient alternative version of itself, one that Mongol cavalry once carried across entire continents at a pace no settled army could match, that Bedouin families still turn into their nation's proudest and most symbolic dish, and that Anatolian villagers still dry patiently on their rooftops every single summer without fail, all of them relying on nothing more sophisticated than milk, salt, and the same patient sun that has been quietly drying food into safety, since long before anyone on earth thought to write any of it down.